Hey everyone, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another video. So today I'm going to be doing a video on flashbacks. Flashbacks are one of the most kind of common devices that can be used in fiction. New writers often overuse them because it's kind of the first device at the front of your mind. When I think of my old books, huge problem I had with most of them was that there were way too many darn flashbacks. I probably wrote in my second novel, the novel was probably 35 to 40% flashback. And my issue with that was that the interesting story was actually in the flashbacks, not the present. So yeah, it's definitely a device that is really useful, but that can be overused. You probably all know what a flashback is, but basically it's a scene that takes place before the fictive present. So a full scene is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's a regular scene. It's structured like a regular scene. It's probably separated by white space. These are great for really important moments of backstory. I wouldn't overuse them. They have the full arc of a regular scene. It's just a scene, except it's taking place in backstory. You know, for backstory, for flashbacks, reserve them for those really important moments. Every moment of backstory doesn't need to be told through a full scene. This was definitely a mistake I made, and why I had such a flashback overload in some of my early work is because I used full scenes for everything when they're not necessary. There are some alternatives to that. So one would be a half scene. A half scene is exactly what it sounds like. It's a short, condensed version of a scene. A lot of the times with half scenes, they're integrated into the middle of a fictive present scene. So you have a scene going on, and then it kind of segues into half scene, and then we jump back. And there's no white space. It's just like when the character in the middle of the fictive present recalls something, there's probably only a few lines of dialogue, 3 to 5 lines of dialogue, and then it ends and we come back. It's just like we're in the fictive present, we dip into backstory, and then we come back and finish up that scene that we were in. Now, unlike full scenes, which are usually separated by white space or by narrative summary, or kind of bridged with narrative summary, half scenes aren't. They're just integrated directly into a regular scene, and they're a great option and a great way to kind of sneakily include more flashbacks because they don't require a full scene, they don't require a ton of space. Too many flashbacks can get really tiring for the reader because inherently flashbacks can lose tension because we kind of know what happens. We might not know exactly. We know the character survives because they're here now. We know what point in their life they are now. So there's less tension because it's in the past and the main questions of the story are in the present. Half scene's a great way to integrate more flashback without kind of testing your reader's patience. And then another way to integrate flashback would be even smaller than half scene. This would be like an 8th scene. This is kind of basically just using exposition or narrative summary very briefly to give us backstory. This is a technique that I've recently started really liking because I think it's a great way to flesh out the backstory without having to commit to a bunch of full scenes. But basically you could be in the middle of a scene and then the character just briefly mentions something that happened in the past in maybe 1 to 3 sentences. It's not even going to be a scene, there's not going to be any dialogue, but it kind of just helps flesh out that this character has a past. It's not even really a scene, it's just a brief mention. So when you're choosing your flashbacks, be conservative with what you show, especially when you're using full scenes. I know it can be tempting, but we don't need to see everything, even every important thing that has happened in your character's past. People have an infinite array of important memories and important moments in their life. Not all of them are going to be necessary. What we want are flashbacks that have kind of a ping-pong effect with the plot. They either provide information we need to know, they set up character relationships, develop the character in a way that's meaningful for us to understand why the character is like this, or why they are the way they are, or they can have kind of a thematic tie-in a lot of the time. But if it's only for theme, I would be careful. Try to make your flashback work a little harder. I wouldn't try to include a flashback just for its thematic importance, but it can be a good way to contribute to your character's arc and your growth through theme. So when you're deciding what flashbacks you're going to include, think about not only what you're going to include, but how you're going to include what. Which flashback needs to be a full scene because it's that crucial? Which ones can be kind of just like a quick diversion into a half scene where we kind of just get the core image and purpose of that scene and we don't really need anything else, and what else can just be mentioned offhandedly. Those offhanded expository details are great for things that aren't necessarily important moments of the character's life, or they aren't super important, but that they still kind of flesh out the character's life and the character's personality. Now, how about segueing into a flashback? Now, when it comes to full scene, I think it's often the most elegant to just have it separated by white space. I don't think you always need to have kind of a neato little memory trigger, which I'll talk about in a second. With a full scene, I think it's fine to just have it offset by white space. Especially in third person, it works really neatly. Even in first person, I think it's fine. I think it's kind of the most elegant way to do it. However, you can have a memory trigger, which is basically something happens that causes the character to think about this thing, and now we segue into a flashback. So we kind of know why the character is thinking about this at this time. Even if your flashback is just offset by white space, we should kind of be able to infer why the character is thinking about this at this time, especially in first person. One common technique is to kind of really tell us by having a lead in. The one thing to keep in mind with memory triggers is not to make them too filtery. I'll leave a link to my video on filters. It's pretty easy to get kind of overt and a bit melodramatic by using a filter. Let's say the main character is digging through the attic and finds her brother's old skateboard, and maybe the main character's kind of lost touch with her brother. There's kind of a more elegant way to do this and a more filtery way to do this. The more filtery way to do this would be to have the character say something like, holding the skateboard makes me think of the time my brother and I don't know, thought it would be fun to put the cat on the skateboard and send it down the hill. Bad idea, don't do that. That sounds like animal abuse. Here, in that case, we've been told objectively through a filter that the character is being reminded. We could do that much more subtly by just showing the character holding the skateboard, maybe a description of the skateboard, and then the main character would say something like, when we were 12, we thought it would be a good idea to send the cat down the hill on the skateboard. We know the main character is remembering, we're being told, it's clearly a memory, but we don't need to be told explicitly, oh, and I was reminded by holding the skateboard. Now, of course, if you're using a half scene, you're probably going to have a clear lead-in and understand why the character is thinking about this right now, because there's no white space and it would be quite jarring to have a random flashback not connected to the scene in any way. So with half scenes especially, you're probably going to need a clear lead-in and a reason why the character is thinking about this right now, but there's no reason to explicitly tell us that the character is remembering. Instead, you can kind of just subtly shift from the present to the past by that one detail that ties the two together. So in this case, it was the skateboard. The skateboard was the thing tying present and past, so through a description of the skateboard, we could just quickly move into the past, and once that memory was done, we could move back into the present. One thing I wanted to touch on is a technique that I don't really think is effective, and that's dreams. Now, I've talked on this channel before about my disdain for dreams. I don't like dreams. I think that they're really weak narrative devices. In most cases, I think they make for weak symbolism, and they're not good for revealing character, and one thing they're especially bad for is flashbacks. I think it can be tempting for a lot of writers to use dreams to show flashbacks because it seems like kind of a elegant solution. But the thing is, like, we all dream about the past. I have had dreams about things that have happened to me in the past, but they're not accurate. Like, when I dream about something that's already happened to me, it's not the same. It's not accurate at all. So using dreams as flashbacks is basically telling the reader that this is deeply unreliable and that none of the details can really be trusted. If you want the memory to be relatively accurate to what actually happened, a dream is not a good vessel for that, because generally when we dream about the past, we're not going to replay exactly what happened as we remember it. It's going to be some weird dream version. Now, I personally think that there is not really any reason to overcomplicate segueing into flashback. It's a question people ask a lot, and I think it's because people overthink how to segue into flashback. It really doesn't have to be that complicated. My recommendation would be to just drop a chronology tag and go. A chronology tag is just a statement of time. It's essentially just telling us where we are on the timeline. It could be 3 months ago, it could be when I was 5, it could be last Tuesday, it could be before the accident. All it does is situate us on the timeline. They're great tools, there's no reason to be afraid to use them. If you're going into a flashback, drop a chronology tag, whether it's a half scene or a full scene, and just go, honestly. Just drop that chronology tag and go. There's really no reason why they have to be avoided or anything. They're great tools for clarity. Segueing into a flashback can be that easy as just drop a chronology tag so we know where we are, so we're not going to be confused, and then show us the flashback. It's so simple that it's hard to believe how simple and easy it is. Like, it's literally so simple and easy that I feel like that's why people overthink it, because they think it can't just be that easy, but it's literally that easy. A couple kind of general rules for using flashback, now that we've talked about types of flashback and how to jump into one. Number one, don't overuse flashback. Like I was saying before, there is a risk with flashback when you overuse it that you seriously kill the tension in the fictive present. You can bore the reader, because the thing is, if the story is in the fictive present, that's what we're here for, that's what we're here to see unfold, that's why we're reading, that's where the tension is, that's where the conflict is, that's what the story we signed up for is. Flashbacks, they can play into that, but it's generally not where the main storyline is housed. So for that reason, you don't want to overuse flashback, because you can really kill the tension of your plot line, because people will most of the time, especially near the start of a book, most of the time not care as much about a flashback as a fictive present scene. Most of your flashbacks will probably be shorter than your average scene in the fictive present. Another thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to use flashback as the inciting incident or as the climax of the story. The two probably most important plot points of your book are flashback. That's kind of a signal that your story is in the past. It doesn't really make sense for the inciting incident to be a flashback unless you're starting in media res, but generally it doesn't make sense because that means the story started a long time ago, which means we're starting way too late. If the climax is a flashback, that means that the story ended before the beginning, because the climax signifies that we're at the end of the story and it's the beginning of the end. Now, the past can be interesting. I would recommend you make flashbacks interesting, but I would use them sparing and keep in mind that although individual flashbacks should be as interesting as the fictive present and have tension, the storyline in the past should not be more interesting than the storyline in the present, because then that's where the story is. Then why are we reading this story? You might have multiple timelines, some books have multiple timelines, but that's if you have multiple timelines, you have multiple interweaving stories. I'm talking about flashbacks, which is you have one main story supported by some flashbacks. Now, one rule, to quote Robert McKee, this is probably from Story, his book Story, it's a good rule to follow. Do not bring in flashback until you have created in your audience a need to know. Flashbacks are great ways to answer questions. They can provide really valuable answers and be full of tension in that way. And if the reader is craving those answers, they will be excited to jump into the past. But if we don't crave those answers, it can be almost frustrating to dive into a flashback when sometimes the details can feel mundane or not as important than what we're getting in the present right now. The last thing I wanted to touch on was when you're using flashback, make sure your tenses are correct. So of course, if your book is in present tense, your flashbacks will be in past tense. That's fairly obvious. Now, if your book is in first person retrospective, meaning your character is looking back at their life, you're gonna use past tense for everything, because everything is happening in the past. Your character is here, the story is here, and that won't change for the flashbacks. You'll just use a chronology tag. The book is in past tense, but it's not a retrospective, and sometimes this still applies if it is a retrospective. The book is in past tense, but now we're jumping into a flashback. So we have the past, which is the whole story, and now we have the past. When we're jumping into the past, we're gonna use past perfect. So let's say the book was in past tense, and the sentence was, I ran to the store. That's in past tense, but it's the fictive present. What if we wanted to jump into flashback? Then we would use the past perfect, and we would say, I had run to the store, to signify that now we're in a different area of the past. However, there's kind of a trick for this, because the past perfect is a pain to read. It's so wordy. So what you can do, and this is kind of a trick, and technically it's not grammatically correct, but if you do it subtly, people won't notice and it will make it much easier to read. Start using the past perfect. After a couple sentences, just kind of segue into simple past and then continue in simple past from there. It'll be much easier to read, and if you do it subtly, people won't really notice the shift. You've established the time frame, you've established we're in the past. Do everyone a favor by slipping into simple past and making this much easier to read. So that is everything I wanted to say on using flashback. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was helpful or interesting or I don't know, something. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video.